Rachel Hayes had perfected the art of being invisible. For 6 months at Forward Operating Base Thunder, she'd filed reports, managed communications, and kept her head down while the desert heat baked Afghanistan's Helmand province into a furnace that reached 120 degrees by noon. The other soldiers knew her as the soft-spoken staff sergeant who typed faster than anyone else and never complained about the conditions that made grown men weep. What they didn't know was why she unconsciously checked wind direction with loose sand every morning, letting the grains slip through her fingers while her eyes tracked the horizon with predatory focus. They didn't notice how her old dog tags, when they caught glimpses of them, bore serial numbers worn away until only ghost impressions remained. Most importantly, they had no idea why she sometimes woke screaming a name that sounded like Stevens, before catching herself and pretending it was just another nightmare about the heat dot captain. Marcus Webb made no secret of his opinion about her presence at Thunder. 6 feet 3 inches of muscle and testosterone, built like the linebacker he'd been in college, Webb represented everything military recruitment posters promised. He'd announced during yesterday's morning briefing, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Sergeant Hayes is our dead weight. But regulations say we need admin staff, so we make do." The words had cut deeper than Webb intended, not because they hurt Rachel's feelings, but because they reminded her of another life, another identity she'd buried beneath paperwork and careful mediocrity. She'd perfected her invisibility so well that even she sometimes forgot who she used to be before the nightmares, before the guilt, before she begged for a transfer to the most remote, boring assignment the Army could offer Doc Private Danny Ramirez. 19 and fresh from boot camp, was one of the few soldiers who treated her with basic respect. Maybe it was because he was too new to have absorbed the casual sexism that permeated places like Thunder. Or maybe he genuinely saw her as a person rather than a filing cabinet with legs. Either way, when he'd asked her yesterday why she always seemed to be listening to something nobody else could hear, she'd almost told him the truth instead. She'd smiled and said the desert played tricks on everyone's ears. It wasn't technically a lie. The desert did play tricks, but Rachel's ears had been trained to hear things that others missed. The distant crack of sniper fire, the whistle of incoming mortar, the specific engine note that meant trouble was coming fast and low over the horizon. 6 months of pretending to be nobody special, and she could still calculate bullet trajectory in her sleep. The morning had started like any other. Intelligence reports suggested possible enemy movement in the area. The Thunder received those reports constantly. Situated in the middle of Taliban country, surrounded by HESCO barriers and razor wire that looked more symbolic than protective, the base housed 50 souls who understood they were essentially sitting ducks, waiting for someone to decide they were worth the ammunition. Rachel had been organizing classified intelligence reports in the command center when the first warning came through. Patrol Delta reporting unusual radio chatter, possible enemy concentration building to the east. Standard procedure called for increased alert status, but not panic. Not yet. She'd glanced at the clock automatically. 1400 hours. 2 in the afternoon. The hottest part of the day, when smart people stayed in the shade and waited for evening dot. But as she'd sorted through communication intercepts, her trained eye had caught patterns that made her blood run cold. References to ghost hunting and settling old debts scattered through the enemy chatter. Mentions of a specific target that needed confirmation before final action. The kind of language that suggested this wasn't a random attack, but something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous. When the alarm sirens started wailing at exactly 1400 hours, Rachel felt the familiar ice in her veins. That meant her carefully constructed new life was about to collide with the violent truth of her past. Through the command center windows, she could see soldiers scrambling to defensive positions, but her attention was fixed on the eastern ridge, where afternoon shadows stretched long across the sand. Something in the light, the wind direction, the specific timing of the attack told her this was no ordinary assault. In exactly 15 minutes, everything at Forward Operating Base Thunder would change forever. And despite 6 months of playing secretary, despite deliberately failing every marksmanship qualification, despite burying her real identity so deep she sometimes believed it herself, Rachel Hayes was about to remember exactly why some people called her ghost. The first thing that would give her away was her hands. When Captain Webb came charging through the command center, screaming about defensive positions and ammunition counts, he wouldn't notice how Rachel's fingers automatically checked the chamber of her sidearm without conscious thought. He wouldn't see how she positioned herself near the weapons rack, not for protection, but because muscle memory was already calculating fields of fire and covered approaches. What he would notice when the shooting started and lives hung in the balance was that his meek little secretary moved through combat like she'd been born for it. And by then, it would be far too late to pretend she was anybody other than exactly who she'd always been. The sirens continued their mechanical shrieking as Rachel stared at the eastern ridge, watching shadows that moved wrong and feeling the weight of a secret that 6 months of hiding couldn't bury. Some ghosts, she was beginning to understand, were meant to walk again. The crack of a K-40-7 fire tore through the afternoon air like sheets of steel rain as Captain Webb burst into the command center, his face already slick with sweat and something that might have been fear. "Hayes!" he roared, spotting Rachel calmly securing classified documents while explosions bloomed against the perimeter walls. "What the hell are you doing? Get to a defensive position." Rachel looked up from the communication log she'd been studying, her expression unreadable. "Sir, the intelligence intercepts suggest this isn't a random attack. The enemy chatter references specific. I don't have time for your secretary theories." Webb cut her off, grabbing an M4 rifle from the weapons rack and checking its action with frustrated, jerky movements. "Take this and try not to shoot yourself." He thrust the weapon at her with barely concealed contempt. "At least pretend you know which end shoots." What Webb didn't notice as Rachel accepted the rifle was how her hands performed an immediate functions check without conscious thought. Her fingers swept across the safety selector with practiced precision, tested the trigger pull, and assessed the weapon's condition in the space of 3 heartbeats. What he also didn't see was how her eyes had gone cold and flat, focused on something beyond the immediate chaos of soldiers scrambling to defensive positions. "Move your ass," Webb shouted as an RPG detonated against a bunker 20 meters away, showering them with concrete dust and twisted metal. "Don't stand there like a sitting duck." But Rachel wasn't moving. She was staring toward the eastern ridge where the afternoon sun created perfect backlight for any sniper worth his training. Something in her stillness made the scorching air suddenly feel cold, as if winter had followed her into the Afghan desert and settled in her bones. Private Ramirez skidded around the corner, his young face tight with barely controlled panic. "Sergeant Hayes, Captain wants you at the supply bunker. We need more magazines and medical supplies." He paused, really looking at her for the first time. "You okay? You look different." Different. If only he knew how accurate that was. 6 months of careful mediocrity were dissolving like sugar in rain, revealing something underneath that had never really gone away. Rachel could feel it rising to the surface despite her best efforts to keep it buried. The part of her that calculated wind speed automatically, that noticed how the enemy fire came in disciplined volleys rather than panicked sprays, that recognized the distinctive crack thump of a Dragunov sniper rifle from 800 meters away. "Tell Captain Webb there's a sniper on the northeast ridge," she said quietly, her voice carrying a new authority that made Ramirez blink in surprise. 800 meters out, probably behind that cluster of rocks. He needs to shift second. Squad 20 meters south, or they'll be sitting ducks. Ramirez stared at her. How could you possibly know that? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that could shatter the careful illusion she'd maintained for 6 months. Rachel met his gaze steadily, seeing in his eyes the first flicker of suspicion that the mousy secretary might be something else entirely. Just tell him, she said finally. Ramirez sprinted back toward Webb's position while Rachel made her way to the supply bunker, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of extensive combat experience. Behind her, she could hear Webb's voice, raised in irritation as Ramirez delivered her warning, followed by the captain's dismissive wave that she'd expected. Webb's type never listened to advice from anyone they considered beneath them, especially not from a woman who spent her days pushing paper. The distinctive crack of the Dragunov sounded again, and this time a soldier from 2nd Squad spun and dropped, clutching his shoulder and screaming for a medic. Webb's eyes went wide as he realized the female desk jockey had been right about something that should have been impossible for her to know. Inside the supply bunker, Rachel loaded her tactical vest with magazines and medical supplies, but her movements were nothing like the usual fumbling of support personnel under fire. Each magazine went into a specific pouch, ammunition types separated by touch for rapid access in darkness. Her vest contained advanced battlefield medical supplies that exceeded standard Army issue by significant margins. Equipment she'd requisitioned through channels that didn't officially exist. Tower 3 is down. They're inside the wire. The panicked voice over the radio made Rachel's blood run cold. Inside the wire meant close quarters combat, meant the Taliban had breached their primary defense perimeter. She grabbed 2 additional rifles from the rack, checking their actions with practiced efficiency that would have surprised anyone watching. But no one was watching. They were all too busy trying not to die by the time Rachel returned to the command post. The situation had deteriorated into barely controlled chaos. Taliban fighters were pouring through the breach in the eastern wall, and Webb's defensive line was crumbling under coordinated assault that spoke of military training rather than rabble tactics. She could see him near the operations center, red-faced and bellowing orders that no one could hear over the symphony of battle. Bodies littered the compound, some moving, some terrifyingly still. The acrid smell of cordite, mixed with dust and blood, created a cocktail that would haunt survivors for years. Through the smoke and chaos, Rachel spotted something that made her trained eye narrow with recognition. The enemy wasn't just attacking randomly. Their movement patterns, their use of covering fire, their coordinated advanced techniques. This was professional work. Fall back to secondary positions. Webb's voice cracked with strain as he spotted Rachel crouched behind a concrete barrier. Hayes, where the hell are those magazines? Before she could respond, he noticed the rifles slung across her back, and his expression twisted with a mixture of fear and fury. What are you doing with those? You're qualified expert on PowerPoint, not rifles. An RPG streaked overhead, exploding against the communications antenna in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. In the momentary lull that followed, Rachel heard it again, that sound pattern that made her spine tingle with recognition. Not random fire, but directed, coordinated assault from someone who understood military tactics. Her eyes swept the ridge. Line, muscle memory from another life taking over completely. Southwest, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. 6 degrees right of that burned-out technical. The way their assault elements are moving, he's got to be there. Webb grabbed her shoulder roughly, his grip tight enough to leave. Bruises. I don't have time for your guessing game, Secretary. Either grab a rifle and pretend to help, or get to the aid station where you belong. His grip tightened painfully, and something flickered in Rachel's eyes that made Ramirez, watching from nearby cover, suddenly understand that Captain Webb had just made a very serious mistake. The mousy secretary was gone, replaced by someone who looked at Webb with the flat, predatory stare of an apex predator evaluating prey. "Actually," Webb continued, his voice thick with contempt, "you want to play soldier? Let's see what our paper pusher can do with a real weapon." Webb unslung his personal M4 with theatrical flourish, the weapon he'd been complaining about all week. The rifle had suffered a malfunction during their last patrol, and the unit armorer hadn't found time to properly service it. Webb thrust it at Rachel with a sneer that would have been comical if people weren't dying around them. "Here, let's see what our paper pusher can do with a real weapon," he taunted, his voice cutting through the ongoing firefight. "Try not to shoot yourself, princess." Rachel took the rifle without comment, her hands automatically beginning a function check while mortar rounds continued walking closer to their position. The bolt carrier was fouled with carbon buildup, and she could feel the gritty resistance as she pulled the charging handle. A quick inspection revealed the source of Webb's complaints, a classic double-feed jam that had been improperly cleared, leaving a spent casing wedged in the chamber. "It's jammed solid," Webb laughed harshly, his fear manifesting as cruel amusement. "Just like your brain when you try to think tactically. Should have stuck to typing, sweetheart." But Rachel was already moving, her fingers flying with a speed that made Ramirez's jaw drop. In 8 seconds, she had the rifle field stripped to basic components, cleared the offending casing, checked the feed ramps, and reassembled the weapon with fluid precision that spoke of muscle memory perfected over thousands of repetitions. "Sports drill," she murmured, performing an immediate action sequence that most soldiers knew in theory, but few could execute under fire with such mechanical perfection. Slap, pull, observe, release, tap, shoot. "How did you?" Ramirez started to ask, but incoming fire sent them all diving for cover. When they looked up, Rachel had already moved to a better position, her body flowing from cover to cover, with an economy of movement that made her oversized uniform suddenly seem irrelevant. She settled into a stable shooting platform behind a concrete barrier, and for the first time since the attack began, she looked like she belonged in a combat zone. "Colonel," Thompson's voice crackled over the command net from his position in the operations center. "All stations, this is Thunder 6. Air support is 15 minutes out. We need to hold until then." Almost as an afterthought, he added, "Who's calling wind corrections on this frequency?" Rachel had unconsciously keyed her radio while calculating. Bullet drift, her voice calm and professional as she provided real-time wind calls and enemy positions to anyone listening. It was the kind of tactical information that company commanders would kill for, delivered with precision that suggested years of experience rather than 6 months of filing reports. Thompson's voice changed, became uncertain. "Say again your call." "Sign." But Rachel had already switched frequencies, her attention focused on the growing threat from the southwest ridge. Through a break in the smoke, she'd spotted what others had missed, a figure standing slightly apart from the fighting, surrounded by bodyguards and gesturing with the unmistakable authority of command. "I've got eyes on their commander," she said quietly to Ramirez, who had somehow become her unofficial battle buddy. "Southwest ridge, approximately 800 meters. The young private squinted through the smoke and dust. "That's impossible. You can barely see the ridgeline, let alone identify individual targets." Radio antenna on his back, 2 guards with RPGs flanking him. Rachel continued with the flat certainty of someone stating simple facts. "He's directing their mortar teams. In about 30 seconds, he's going to order them to shift fire to the operations center." True to her prediction, mortar rounds began impacting near the ops center exactly 30 seconds later. Webb, who had been close enough to overhear, stared at her with a mixture of suspicion and fear that bordered on panic. "How the hell could you know that?" His voice cracked slightly. "What aren't you telling us?" Rachel didn't answer. She was busy calculating wind speed, distance, elevation changes, and the unique ballistics of the damaged rifle she'd just repaired. The math came as naturally as breathing, numbers flowing through her mind in a cascade of angles and adjustments that felt like coming home after a long absence. "You're not seriously going to try to?" Ramirez watched her settle into a prone position, the meme force steady in her hands despite the chaos around them. "That's 800 meters with iron sights and a foul barrel. Nobody could make that shot." Webb had noticed her positioning and came charging over, his face purple with rage and something that looked like genuine terror. "Hayes, what the hell do you think you're doing? You'll waste ammunition and give away our position." He tried to grab the rifle from her hands, but the sharp crack of Rachel's voice cut through his tirade like a blade. "Captain, either help or get out of my way. People are dying." It was the first time she'd shown any emotion beyond quiet professionalism, and something in her tone made Webb step back involuntarily. Her usually soft brown eyes had gone cold and flat, focused on something beyond the immediate chaos of the firefight. As she settled deeper into her shooting position, her tactical vest shifted and revealed something that made Ramirez gasp audibly. A scar on her right shoulder, circular and pronounced, with radiating lines spreading outward like a starburst. It was the kind of mark left by thousands of hours with a rifle stock pressed into exactly the same spot. The kind of scar earned through dedication that bordered on obsession. "Full value, right to left, gusting 5 to 7 meters per second, Rachel murmured, making minute adjustments to her sight picture. Her breathing slowed, fell into a rhythm that seemed divorced from the battle raging around them. Between heartbeats, in that space where time stretches thin, she found the zone that elite shooters spend lifetimes trying to achieve. The damaged rifle in her hands was no longer a liability but simply another variable to factor into her calculations. She'd already compensated for the bent front sight post, the fouled barrel that would affect bullet spin, and the way the afternoon heat created shimmer that could throw off point of aim at distance. Webb opened his mouth to protest again, but Thompson's voice over the radio stopped him cold. "All stations, enemy commander identified on southwest ridge. We need immediate suppression on that position, or we're done." The colonel's usual calm was cracking under pressure. "Anyone with a clear shot, take it." Rachel smiled grimly, her finger finding the trigger and beginning the steady rearward pressure that would send a 5.56 millimeter message across 800 meters of Afghan desert. But just as she reached the breaking point, the rifle jammed again. The click of a dead trigger sent ice through Rachel's veins. Another malfunction. The enemy commander was already moving, his security detail preparing to relocate to a better position. In 3 seconds, the shot window would close forever. Without conscious thought, Rachel's hands executed a tap rack bang drill with violence and precision that spoke of muscle memory forged in crucibles far from this dusty forward operating base. The forward assist slammed home. The bolt carrier lurched forward, and she was back on target before Webb could finish his curse. Time dilated. Between one heartbeat and the next, Rachel found that perfect intersection of breath, sight picture, and trigger press that separated professionals from amateurs. The damaged Me-4 bucked against her shoulder, its report lost in the symphony of battle. 800 meters away. Through dust and smoke and chaos, the enemy commander's head snapped, back in a pink mist that hung in the air like a gruesome exclamation point. His body crumpled with the boneless finality that comes only from a perfect central nervous system shot. For 3 seconds, nothing changed. The battle continued its deadly rhythm. Then the enemy radio exploded in panic chatter as they're coordinated. Assault collapsed into chaos. Holy mother of... Ramirez couldn't finish the sentence. He was staring at Rachel with the expression of someone who just watched a magic trick that violated the laws of physics. His young face cycled through disbelief, awe, and the dawning realization that the quiet secretary who'd helped him fill out paperwork had just performed what most soldiers would consider a miracle. Webb's mouth hung open, his face cycling through emotions like a broken slot machine. Disbelief, shock, and something that might have been fear. Around them, other soldiers were pointing at the southwest ridge, phones and cameras appearing despite the ongoing firefight as everyone tried to capture what they'd just witnessed. Impossible, Webb muttered, raising his binoculars to confirm what his eyes refused to believe. Through the magnified lenses, he could see the enemy position in chaos. Taliban fighters dragging their commander's body to cover, their disciplined attack disintegrating into confusion and retreat. Nobody makes that shot. Not with iron sights, not with a damaged rifle, not at 800 meters. But the evidence was undeniable. The coordinated assault that had been overwhelming their defenses moments before was falling apart like a house of cards. Enemy fighters who had been pressing their attack with military precision suddenly found themselves leaderless, confused, pulling back in disorder that spoke of complete command breakdown. Rachel was already transitioning to her secondary sector of fire, engaging targets with controlled pairs that found their mark with monotonous regularity. Each shot was calculated, precise, economical. No wasted ammunition, no panic fire, just a methodical application of violence by someone who understood its language intimately. Contact left, 200 meters, she called out, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The Taliban assault was faltering, their coordinated attack devolving into a disorganized retreat as word of their commanders. Death spread through their ranks like wildfire. Colonel Thompson's voice crackled over the command net, tight with barely controlled emotion. Outstanding shooting. Who made that shot? I need a name for the after-action report. Webb keyed his radio, his voice uncertain for the first time since Rachel had known him. Sir, it was Sergeant Hayes, the admin. NCO. The silence that followed stretched for several seconds, filled only by the diminishing sound of enemy fire and the distinctive whoop-whoop-whoop of rotors in the distance. When Thompson finally responded, his voice was barely audible, meant more for himself than the radio net. Ghost? After all this time? It can't be. The word hit Rachel like a physical blow. Ghost. A call sign she hadn't heard in 3 years. A name she'd tried to bury beneath paperwork and carefully maintain mediocrity. But hearing it now, spoken with the shocked recognition of someone who knew exactly what it meant, brought everything flooding back. 2 black U-60 helicopters materialized from the heat shimmer like predatory insects, flying fast and low with the aggressive precision of special operations aircraft. They flared hard over the forward operating base, door gunners already, engaging targets on the ridgeline with devastating accuracy that turned the Taliban retreat into a rout. Rachel's eyes tracked their approach, noting the lack of unit markings, the modified rotor systems designed for quiet operation, the specific way they moved through the battle space with lethal purpose. She knew these birds. More importantly, she knew who flew them. Ropes dropped from both helicopters before they'd even finished their combat descent. Operators in black kit fast roped down with a speed that made regular infantry look like they were moving through molasses. No patches, no identification, just anonymous dealers of death who moved through the battlefield with terrible efficiency. Delta Force. The cavalry had arrived, but Rachel knew this wasn't coincidence. Someone had made a call. Someone had spoken a name that hadn't been used in 3 years. A name that brought ghosts out of administrative hiding and back into the world they tried to leave behind. The operators flowed through the forward operating base's defensive positions like water finding its level, reinforcing weak points and engaging targets with surgical precision. One of them, a master sergeant with graying temples visible beneath his helmet, paused when he saw Rachel. Even through his ballistic sunglasses, she could see the recognition, the disbelief, the questions that would have to wait until the shooting. Stopped not within minutes. The combined firepower of Thunder's defenders and the Delta operators had broken the Taliban assault completely. Enemy fighters streamed back over the ridgelines, leaving their dead and wounded behind in their haste to escape the sudden reversal of fortune. The immediate threat was over, but Rachel could feel the weight of eyes on her. Not just Webb and Ramirez, but the Delta operators who kept glancing her way with expressions that mixed recognition with impossibility. The careful anonymity she'd maintained for 6 months was cracking like thin ice under the weight of a secret too large to contain. As the dust settled and casualty reports started coming in, a third helicopter appeared on the horizon. This one was different, a command bird with communication arrays bristling from its hull like electronic quills. It circled once, as if the pilot was confirming something, before setting down near the operations center with the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. The man who stepped out made Colonel Thompson snapped to attention so fast he might have thrown out his back. Major General Patricia Knox, commander of Joint Special Operations Command. The kind of brass that never, ever showed up at a tiny forward operating base unless something monumentally significant had occurred. Knox strode through the carnage with the purposeful gait of someone who'd walked through too many battlefields to be fazed by another. Her security detail spread out in protective formation, but her attention was focused on one person with laser-like intensity. She stopped in front of Rachel, who had risen to attention, despite the rifle still cradled in her hands. For a long moment, the two women stared at each other, one in stars and polished brass, the other in dusty combat fatigues and borrowed equipment. "Master Sergeant Hayes," Knox said quietly, using a rank that made Webb's head snap around so fast. He nearly gave himself whiplash. "Or should I still call you Ghost?" Rachel's carefully maintained facade finally cracked. 3 years of hiding, of pretending to be nobody special, of filing papers and keeping her head down, all of it crumbled in the face of that call sign and the memories it carried. "Ma'am," she said, her voice barely steady, "I'm just admin support." "Now, my enlistment contract clearly states your contract was voided the moment you picked up that rifle," Knox interrupted, pulling out a tablet and swiping through classified files with casual disregard for the dozen soldiers within earshot. "Operation Blackwater, Helmand Province. 3 years ago, you and your spotter held off 200 Taliban fighters for 16 hours while 30 Navy SEALs extracted a downed pilot. When your position was overrun, you killed 7 enemy combatants in hand-to-hand combat before the quick reaction force arrived." Webb had gone pale, his legs visibly shaking as the implications hit him like successive body blows. The story was legend in Special Operations circles 2 Delta Force snipers against impossible odds. One killed in action, the other disappearing into the classified shadows of official records. Everyone had assumed both operators were male. The idea that one had been a woman, that she'd been serving as their secretary for 6 months, was breaking his brain in real time. "The official report listed you as killed in action," Knox continued, her voice carrying the weight of classified truth. "Imagine my surprise when Fort Bragg's artificial intelligence system flagged a routine marksmanship qualification from a nobody admin sergeant that matched your shooting signature exactly." She gestured at the battlefield around them, where medics moved among the wounded and engineers assessed damage to the perimeter. "Then this afternoon, I get a flash message that someone at Forward Operating Base Thunder just made an impossible shot that saved the entire garrison. Coincidences like that don't exist in our world, Sergeant." Rachel stood perfectly still, but Ramirez could see the micro-tremors in her hands, the way her jaw clenched and unclenched as 3 years of carefully constructed lies collided with unavoidable truth. The young private was beginning to understand that everything he thought he knew about the quiet woman who'd helped him with paperwork was not just wrong, but spectacularly, impossibly wrong. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am?" Rachel's voice carried a note of desperation that made several nearby soldiers exchange glances. Knox nodded, her expression unreadable behind aviator sunglasses that reflected the Afghan sun like mirrors. "I requested the discharge. I requested the new identity. After Blackwater, after losing Stevens, I couldn't." Rachel's voice caught, and for a moment the legendary operator disappeared, replaced by a woman carrying 3 years of guilt and grief. "I needed to not be Ghost anymore. I just wanted to serve quietly, without the weight of that name." And yet, Knox gestured at the battlefield around them. When lives were on the line, Ghost emerged. You can change your name, hide in admin roles, pretend to be nobody special, but you can't change who you are at your core. She turned to Colonel Thompson, who had appeared at her elbow like a faithful dog waiting for orders. "Colonel, I'm officially reactivating Master Sergeant Hayes to operational status. Effective immediately. She's assigned to Task Force 88. Ma'am," Rachel's voice carried genuine panic now. "Respectfully, I'm not that person anymore. I haven't touched a rifle in 3 years. I'm not ready for—" Knox cut her off with a sharp gesture that brooked no argument. "Not ready? You just made a shot that most Tier 1 snipers would call impossible, with a damaged weapon under combat conditions. You saved this entire forward operating base. Tell me again how you're not ready." The Delta Master Sergeant, who'd recognized her earlier, approached, pulling off his sunglasses to reveal weathered features and knowing eyes that had seen too much violence to be surprised by anything. "Ghost," he said simply, using the call sign, like a greeting between old friends. "We thought you were dead. We held a memorial service. Your star is on the wall at Bragg." Rachel met his gaze steadily, and something passed between them that spoke of shared operations, classified missions, and the bond between operators who trusted each other with their lives in places that didn't officially exist. "Thompson, how's the knee?" she asked, and the Master Sergeant laughed a short bark of surprise and recognition. "Still clicks when it rains, just like you said it would after that house in Mosul." They shared a moment of understanding that excluded everyone else, a conversation conducted in the shorthand of professionals who'd worked together in the shadows. Webb watched this exchange with growing horror, finally understanding that the woman he'd dismissed as dead weight was not just competent, but legendary among the most elite soldiers in the American military. You're Delta Force," Webb said, his voice coming out as more of a croak than actual speech. "You're the Ghost, the one who ... He trailed off, unable to reconcile the quiet woman who typed his reports with the mythical operator standing before him. Webb's face went through a spectrum of emotions as the full weight of his behavior crashed down on him. "I called you dead. Wait, I threw you a broken rifle and laughed about it. Oh God, I am so sorry. I didn't know. I couldn't have known." Rachel turned to him, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Thunder, Webb saw the real person beneath the carefully maintained facade. Not the meek secretary, not the invisible support staff, but a warrior who'd seen more combat than most soldiers could imagine. "You couldn't have known because I didn't want you to know," she said quietly, her voice carrying neither anger nor accusation, just statement of fact. "Warriors don't advertise, Captain. They just serve." Knox pulled out a folder marked with classification stamps that made Thompson take an involuntary step backward. "There's another reason I'm here," she said, handing the folder to Rachel with the gravity of someone passing along a death sentence. "Operation Silent Storm. We've been tracking a high-value target in the Hindu Kush for 6 months. Someone who knows our tactics, our procedures, our operational signatures. Someone who's been one step ahead of every operation we've mounted. She paused meaningfully, watching Rachel's face for reaction. Someone who might be connected to what happened at Blackwater 3 years ago. Rachel's hands stilled on the folder, her knuckles going white as the implications hit her. Connected how? Knox's expression was grim as winter in Alaska. The enemy commander you just neutralized wasn't random, Ghost. Signal intelligence indicates. He was trained by the same network that set up the Blackwater ambush. The network that knew exactly where you and Stevens would be positioned, exactly when the SEALs would arrive for extraction. The revelation hit like a physical blow, and Rachel's carefully maintained control finally shattered completely. You're telling me the shot I just made, that wasn't random. That wasn't just another Taliban commander. Knox shook her head slowly. Nothing about today was random. The intelligence that suggested this forward operating base would be hit. The specific timing of the attack, even the fact that you were assigned here, none of it was coincidence. Someone wanted to draw me out, Rachel said flatly, her tactical mind already processing the implications. To confirm I was still alive. And now they know, Knox confirmed. Now they know Ghost is still breathing, still operational, still dangerous. Which is why I need you back on active status immediately. The weight of 3 years of hiding, of trying to be somebody else, of running from a past that refused to stay buried, settled on Rachel's shoulders like a lead blanket. Around them, the forward operating base was slowly returning to something resembling normal operations. But she could feel the stares of soldiers who'd witnessed something extraordinary. Webb approached hesitantly, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. I owe you more than an apology, he said, his voice thick with shame and gratitude. I owe you my life. All our lives. If you hadn't made that shot, any soldier here would have done the same with the skills they possessed, Rachel replied graciously. I just happened to have the right skills for the moment. It was a generous response to a man who didn't deserve grace, but professionalism was ingrained in her bones. Even now, with her cover blown and her past exposed, she couldn't bring herself to make Webb's shame worse than it already was. As the Delta operators prepared for extraction, Thompson pulled Rachel aside, his weathered face grave with the weight of classified knowledge. The folder Knox gave you, I know what Silent Storm is about. The target isn't just connected to Blackwater. He is Blackwater, the architect of the whole operation. Rachel's eyes hardened to chips of winter ice. You're certain? Thompson nodded grimly. Signal intercepts, human intelligence, pattern analysis, it all points to one man. Khalid al-Rashani, former Pakistani intelligence, trained at Fort Benning in the 90s. He knows our playbook inside and out because we taught it to him. He paused, watching her face carefully. He's the one who killed Stevens, who almost killed you. The name hit like a sledgehammer to her chest. Rachel had carried Stevens's dog tags for 3 years, kept them in her desk drawer next to her stapler and paper clips, a constant reminder of the partner she'd failed to save. Now she had a name, a target, a purpose that went beyond simple service. When do we launch? The question came out flat, professional, but Thompson could hear the steel underneath. He smiled grimly. That's the Ghost I remember. Welcome back to the war, Master Sergeant. The real war. Knox reappeared as if summoned by their conversation, her expression unreadable behind those aviator sunglasses. The bird leaves in 30 minutes, Ghost. Pack what you need. It's time to come home. She turned to leave, then paused with the dramatic timing of someone who delivered bad news to grieving families too many times to count. Oh, and Captain Webb, I'll be recommending you for remedial leadership training. Any commander who treats their personnel as dead weight without knowing their capabilities is a liability I can't afford in my area of operations. Webb's face flushed deep red, but he had the sense to keep his mouth shut. His career was probably over, and everyone within Earshot knew it. The kind of spectacular misjudgment he displayed wasn't the sort of thing that got overlooked at promotion boards. As Knox strode away, her security detail flowing around her like professional shadows, Rachel stood in the settling dust of a battlefield that had changed everything. 3 years of hiding ended by one shot. 3 years of anonymity shattered. By necessity and the ghosts of operations past, Ramirez approached hesitantly, still processing everything he'd witnessed. The kid who'd thought he knew his quiet sergeant was struggling to reconcile the woman who'd helped him fill out leave requests with the legendary operator who'd just saved their lives. Sergeant, I mean. Master Sergeant, I mean, ... He stopped, flustered by the sudden complexity of military protocol. What do I even call you now? Rachel considered the question, weighing the weight of names and identities against the reality of who she'd always been underneath the carefully constructed facade. Ghost is dead, she said quietly, testing the words against the desert air. Has been for 3 years. But maybe she looked at the rifle in her hands, at the blood on the ground, at the soldiers who'd survived because she'd acted when action was needed. Maybe some ghosts were meant to walk again. Thompson handed her a new set of dog tags, the real ones that had been locked in a safe at Fort Bragg since her supposed death. She held them up to the light, reading the name and numbers. That told the truth about who she was beneath all the pretense. Master Sergeant Rachel Stevens Hayes. Blood type O negative. Religion no preference. And at the bottom, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, the designation that changed everything. TF-88 Operator ... as she slipped the tags around her neck, tucking them under her uniform. The weight felt both familiar and strange. The metal was cold against her skin, a reminder of the life she'd tried to leave behind and the duty that kept pulling her back into the darkness. Webb approached one final time, his arrogance completely evaporated, replaced by something that might have been genuine humility. I owe you more than an apology, he said, his voice thick with shame. I owe you my life. All our lives. If you hadn't made that shot, any soldier here would have done the same with the skills they possessed. Rachel replied with grace that Webb didn't deserve. I just happened to have the right skills for the moment. It was a professional response that elevated both of them. The kind of leadership by example that separated true warriors from mere soldiers. Even now, with her cover blown and her past exposed, she couldn't bring herself to make Webb's humiliation worse than it already was. But as the black helicopter spun up its rotors and dust began swirling around the landing zone, Rachel's thoughts weren't on forgiveness or redemption. They were on Stevens, on Blackwater, on debts unpaid and justice too long deferred. She'd hidden for 3 years, tried to bury Ghost, beneath paperwork and anonymity and the careful construction of a life that meant nothing. The helicopter lifted off, banking hard toward the setting sun that painted the Afghan desert golden red like spilled blood. Through the window, Rachel could see the ridgeline where she'd made the shot that changed everything, now bathed in the dying light of a day that had resurrected ghosts and settled old scores. 800 meters, a damaged rifle, one chance to make a difference. In the end, that's what it always came down to in their world. One shot, one opportunity to tip the balance between life and death, victory and defeat, justice and the endless cycle of violence that consumed everything it touched. She'd taken that shot today, saved lives, revealed herself to enemies who thought her dead and buried. Now those enemies knew the truth that she'd tried so hard to deny. Ghost was coming for them. And this time, she wasn't going to disappear into administrative obscurity when the shooting stopped. The helicopter disappeared into the Afghan dusk, carrying a legend back to the world of shadows and violence where legends were born and heroes went to die. But as the mountains swallowed the sound of rotors and the desert settled back into its ancient silence, one truth echoed through the Valley's like a promise and a threat. Warriors don't retire. They just wait. And the waiting was over. 6 months later, the briefing room at Joint Special Operations Command buzzed with the controlled tension that preceded high-stakes operations. Rachel sat at the mahogany table, her hands steady as she reviewed satellite imagery and intelligence reports that painted a clear picture of their target's location. Khalid al-Rashidi had made a mistake, the kind of arrogance-driven error that had gotten better men than him killed. Target acquired, Rachel announced to the assembled operators, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. Al-Rashidi is confirmed at the compound in the Coincidental Valley. He's scheduled to meet with his network commanders tomorrow at 1400 hours. Major General Knox leaned forward, studying the photographs spread across the table. Intelligence indicates this is our best opportunity. He's been moving constantly since Thunder, but this meeting is too important for him to delegate. She looked directly at Rachel. He knows you're coming, Ghost. This could be a trap. Rachel's smile was winter cold and sharp as a blade. I'm counting on it. The plan was surgical in its precision. A small team would infiltrate the valley under cover of darkness, establish overwatch positions, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. No massive assault, no collateral damage, just a methodical application of violence by professionals who understood that some debts could only be paid in blood. Thompson, now serving as her spotter again after 3 years apart, checked his equipment with practiced efficiency. Just like old times, he said quietly, but his eyes held the knowledge of what they'd lost at Blackwater and what they stood to lose again. Not like old times, Rachel corrected him, her voice carrying a note of finality that made the other operators look up. This time, we finish it. The helicopter insertion went flawlessly, the team moving through the Afghan night like ghosts themselves. Rachel felt the familiar rush of operational adrenaline, the sharp focus that came with being exactly where she belonged. For 6 months, she'd trained, planned, and prepared for this moment when she could finally balance the scales that had been tilted by Stevens's death by dawn. They were in position 800 meters from the target compound, the same distance as her impossible shot at Thunder. The symmetry wasn't lost on her. Sometimes the universe offered perfect circles, chances to end things where they began. Target in sight, Thompson whispered through his scope. Al-Rashidi just entered the main building. 2 bodyguards, both armed. No sign of the meeting participants yet. Rachel settled into her shooting position, feeling the familiar weight of her rifle and the steady rhythm of her breathing. Through her scope, she could see the man who'd orchestrated Stevens' death, who'd turned their mission into an ambush, who'd forced her to carry 3 years of guilt for being the one who survived. "This is for Stevens," she whispered, so quietly that only Thompson could hear. The shot was perfect, clean, precise, final. Al-Rashidi dropped without a sound, and with him died the network that had haunted her dreams and murdered her partner. The other operators moved in to confirm the kill and collect intelligence, but Rachel remained in position, watching the compound through her scope. It was over. 3 years of running, hiding, pretending to be someone else, all of it ended with one perfectly placed bullet and the satisfaction of knowing that Stevens could finally rest in peace. 2 weeks after the Coincidental operation, Rachel stood in Arlington National Cemetery, the morning sun casting long shadows across the endless rows of white headstones. In her hands, she held Stevens's dog tags, the one she'd carried for 3 years, like a talisman of grief and guilt. Section 60. Row 15. Grave marker 47. She'd memorized the location long before she'd had the courage to visit. Technical Sergeant David Michael Stevens, Delta Force operator, died in service to his country at age 28. The headstone was simple, elegant, and utterly inadequate to capture the man who'd been her partner, her friend, and the brother she'd never had. "I got him, Dave," she said quietly, placing the dog tags on the grave marker with hands that no longer shook. Al-Rashidi is dead. The network is dismantled. It's finished. The words felt strange on her tongue. Finished. For 3 years, her life had been defined by unfinished business, unpaid debts, and the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. Now, with justice finally served, she felt oddly empty, as if removing the burden had left a hole she didn't know how to fill. "Master Sergeant Hayes?" The voice behind her was young, uncertain, and surprisingly familiar. Rachel turned to find Private Ramirez, former Private Ramirez. She corrected herself, noting the specialist insignia on his uniform. He looked older, more confident, carrying himself with the bearing of a soldier who'd seen combat and lived to tell about it. "Danny," she said, genuinely pleased to see him. "What brings you to Arlington?" He gestured toward another section of the cemetery, where a small gathering was taking place around a fresh grave. "Sergeant Miller from Thunder. Lost him in Kandahar last month. IED. His voice carried the matter-of-fact tone that soldiers used to discuss death, but Rachel could see the grief in his eyes. They stood together in comfortable silence, 2 warriors, paying their respects to the fallen. Finally, Ramirez spoke again. "I never thanked you properly for that day at Thunder." "Saving all our lives," Rachel shook her head. "You don't need to thank me for doing my job. Is that what it was?" Ramirez asked. "Your job? Or was it something more?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications about duty and purpose, and the reasons why people chose to serve. Rachel considered her answer carefully, thinking about the path that had led her from ghost to secretary to ghost again. "Both," she said finally. "It was my job because I'm a soldier, but it was something more because those were my people, and soldiers don't abandon their people. Ever." Ramirez nodded, understanding passing between them. "What happens now? Do you go back to being ghost full-time?" Rachel looked down at Stephen's grave, then back at the young soldier who'd become an unlikely friend during her months of hiding. "I don't know," she admitted. "For 3 years, everything I did was about getting justice for Stevens. Now that it's done, ... She trailed off, uncertain how to articulate the strange sense of completion and emptiness that came with finishing a mission that had defined her life. The ghost was a weapon finely honed and perfectly calibrated for dealing death to America's enemies. But what was a weapon supposed to do when there were no more targets to eliminate? "Maybe that's okay," Ramirez said quietly. "Maybe not knowing what comes next is better than being trapped by what came before." It was surprisingly wise advice from someone barely old enough to drink legally, and Rachel found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. "When did you get so philosophical, specialist?" "Combat has a way of making you think about things," he replied. "Especially when you've seen what happens when people underestimate each other. Captain Webb never lived that down, by the way. He's teaching ROTC at some college in Ohio now." Rachel felt a momentary flash of sympathy for Webb, whose spectacular misjudgment had ended his military career in the most public way possible. But the feeling passed quickly. Actions had consequences, and Webb had learned that lesson the hard way. "I should go," Ramirez said, glancing toward his fallen comrade's service. "But Ghost... Rachel... Thank you for showing me what a real soldier looks like." After he left, Rachel remained by Stevens's grave for another hour, watching the sun climb higher and feeling something inside her chest slowly unclenching for the first time in 3 years. The debt was paid. The mission was complete. Stevens could rest in peace, and maybe, finally, so could she. As she walked away from Arlington, Rachel's phone buzzed with a text message from Knox. "New operation, Bruno. High-value target in Somalia. Interested?" Rachel stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back a single word: "Always." Because that was the truth about warriors like her. They didn't retire, they didn't fade away, and they sure as hell didn't spend their lives filing paperwork and pretending to be something they weren't. They served, they fought, and when one mission ended, they prepared for the next one. Ghost was back, and the world's enemies should be very, very afraid. The war continued, as it always had and always would. But now Rachel Hayes fought it as herself. No more hiding, no more pretending, no more carrying guilt that belonged to the men who'd killed her partner. She was Master Sergeant Rachel Hayes, call sign Ghost, and she had work to do. Some people were born to be soldiers. Others chose the profession. But a rare few, like Rachel, were soldiers in their bones, in their blood, in the very fiber of their being. They were the ones who stood between civilization and chaos, who carried the burden of violence so others could sleep peacefully. And when the next call came, and it would come, Ghost would be ready. After all, warriors don't retire. They just reload. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.